Hey everyone, hope you guys are doing well. I'm FPL Fran, and today's video is going to be my Game Week 14 team selection. As we know, looking at last week, it was one of those weeks where unfortunately I made a little bit of a doomed transfer where I went from Gordon to Palmer. And of course, that's a sideways move, but I did so that I could actually afford the move from Diaby to Mbumo, knowing that in the future, of course, Mbumo would get some price rises and Palmer himself would get some. Now, of course, what ultimately ended up happening is I ended up with 52 points, which was still a green arrow. But of course, as you might be laughing here, Gordon, of course, got 1 goal, 1 assist. And of course, I ended up 10 points worse off, fortunately, due to, let's say, Diaby getting 45 minutes substituted, and same with Cash. I ended up with playing Colwell too, so I got 52 points last week. That sends me to the top 40k in the world. Of course, as I said, I do regret moving out of Gordon slightly, but I also think that there wasn't many other choices in terms of the team structure I wanted to build for the future. I wanted to save a little bit of money with Palmer, and I'm happy I did so in the end, and I've captured a few price rises, which will hopefully help me in the long term. And as far as Colwell, of course, dismaying to see that he didn't get the start versus Newcastle, but, ultimately, I don't think the result would have been too different. Chelsea were absolutely battered. They conceded 4 goals ultimately. Colwell starting, for example, would have probably netted him maybe a -1, maybe 0, just like he did anyways when he came off the bench when Reece James actually got a very, very silly red card, if we're being honest. So that was the situation with my team. Moving on, of course, I think just looking at the sort of problem points in my team, I think what I can easily say is that for me, Colwell is still a question mark. I don't really know if I can depend on Colwell. Of course, he will play this fixture versus Brighton, but it's still Brighton, right? We're still not really expecting for maybe Chelsea to get a clean sheet here. I think this is still a good fixture for Brighton. So not that keen really on playing Colwell, but I don't really mind playing him if I'm forced to do so. As far as Cash, I think he's become noticeably a worse option, and that's also partially why, for example, I would have dropped him on the cheat sheet as well, or dropped him completely out of the cheat sheet. I think Cash's position on the team is a little bit debatable. What you can see, as I said in recent weeks, is a lot of teams have targeted the overlap within Cash, right? Knowing that, for example, he's someone who bombards forwards, and that there's actually a huge gap between, let's say, Cash and his right center-back pairing. So what we've seen, of course, in Unai Emery's instance within the Spurs game is that he did move Cash off, took him off at 45 minutes, also because he made a lot of sort of key mistakes, right? And was very, very close and on the edge of a red card. So probably, I don't think Cash's position necessarily in the team has been completely lost. But the point is that he can be someone who's not necessarily nailed. And of course, at that sort of price point for Cash with the fixtures ahead, he probably is a sell, and I have a chance here to, of course, improve the quality of my team going forwards. Whereas when I look at someone like Pedro Porro or Tsimikas, I think we've got upside there, right? Tsimikas has been playing quite well recently, and sort of against, our expectations, I think Joe Gomez hasn't really found his way back into the team, particularly in that sort of left back spot, and we'll see what happens with Europe as well. I'm recording this video before Liverpool will play in the Europa League, but the expectation, of course, is that Tsimikas can be quite dependable for the next few fixtures, and the same with Porro after the Man City fixture, because Porro right now, the upside is huge. You have set pieces, someone who's basically playing at ridiculous advanced attacking positions, and so for that reason, I think Porro is very, very interesting, and definitely one of the sort of top options in terms of expected goal involvement in the league as well. So I love Porro as an option, happy to use him as far as Game Week 15 onwards. As far as Areola, he's still a problem point, but the question, I suppose, is do I have enough money to upgrade Areola? Right now, you can actually see that I've got 0.4 in the bank, and I don't really have the capacity to move away from Areola into someone that I like. What I like is maybe Sanchez, potentially, but I don't really know if Sanchez and Colwell is the best way to invest into Chelsea. Maybe if Chelsea continues to strengthen up as a team, I don't really want my triple up to be that weak, I suppose. I would like to leave some room for maybe Nkunku in the future, and maybe reconsider, for example, the reintroduction of something like Raheem Sterling into my team. So that's another thing I'm thinking about. In terms of, let's say, Raya, I'm blocked from that from a price point of view. As far as, let's say, moving Areola on to Flecken, I'm also not sure if I want to move into Flecken this week, because ultimately, even though Flecken has a great fixture versus Luton, he's still a blank game week player in 18, and Areola is a very, very serviceable keeper for this week only, right? Yes, of course, West Ham have been absolutely shocking as a defense, and I don't think they're, anywhere better than, let's say, a bottom 5 defense, but ultimately, maybe a move for a keeper can actually be better served next week. So as far as the midfield, though, I think right now I've sort of moved into a template midfield setup that I'm happy with. I obviously lost Gordon, but I don't think I'm going to be moving back to Gordon anytime soon. I think the next time we'll be moving into Gordon potentially could be Game Week 18, because around Game Week 18 is when we start to consider hey, maybe let's move off some of the Asian Cup players. Maybe let's move off of some of the AFCON players. And one of the AFCON players that I could actually move away from would be Mbumo, right? Because ultimately, if I'm not going to free at 18, then actually owning someone like Gordon could be really, really good for my team. So I think maybe Mbumo to Gordon as a fixture sort of plan for the future could be quite nice. And that's the idea there. As far as Watkins and Haaland, for me, they're very, very stable picks. And I think, of course, as I've been saying it in my cheat sheet video as well, I think we're sort of moving into a landscape where, of course, if we were to go with a one premium structure, I think I would favor Haaland. And that would be specifically after Game Week 16 onwards, right? Because Game Weeks 14 and 15 are really, really good for Salah. You could argue that Salah is the best captaincy for both 14 and 15. I personally think that the sort of margins have moved a little bit in terms of the Game Week 14 captaincy, and we'll talk about that at the end of this video. But I think, of course, when you're, let's say, reaching that roadblock in Game Week 16, and let's say you're on a no Haaland team, I think it might make sense to actually move from Salah to Haaland in Game Week 16, as soon as that. As far as, let's say, the double template where we have Salah and Haaland right now, I've got no real reason to move off of either Salah or Haaland in the short term. So I think it's about moving Salah maybe around Game Week 18, as I mentioned, or, as late as basically right before he goes to AFCON. As far as Watkins, of course, he's extremely stable, but we do know that the Man City and Arsenal fixtures are coming, fast and thick. So that's going to be a question mark. Do I have some upside to move into someone else? And of course, Darwin and Isaac are great options. So in terms of my first transfer plan and my first transfer option, that's actually going to be to move away from Cash, who I mentioned, of course, is a deteriorating asset, in my opinion, into someone like Zinchenko. So what I would do here in this situation, in this team selection, would be to play Areola, to play Gabriel, and to play Tsimikas as well, expecting that Tsimikas would play here, putting Porro, of course, at the back of my bench, and then replacing Colwell, who would also be on my bench, with Zinchenko. And in this situation, of course, I'm going with double Arsenal defense, which I think is very, very strong. Ultimately, the next two fixtures are really, really good. We know that this Arsenal team have honestly markedly improved as a defensive team and as a defensive unit. And Zinchenko does provide you with some upside. What I like about Zinchenko, particularly for this week, is he got rested in the Champions League fixture at 45 minutes, right? So it shows you one of the concerns I think with Zinchenko that we've always had is, first of all, Arsenal can absolutely blow away Wolves, and maybe the same thing, exactly the same will happen, right? Zinchenko could come off at 45 minutes, and that could be a problem. But we also know that the Premier League, the games are a little bit tougher in terms of how often really we have these sort of crazy goal shows compared to the Champions League. I'm not even saying, for example, quality of opponent being different. It's just the case that, for example, you don't really see teams absolutely explode. Even in Arsenal's best results this season, Sheffield United, a lot of those goals, for example, are scored in the second half. So I'm hoping, of course, that someone like Zinchenko can survive until 60 minutes in this situation and get the start versus Wolves, but not only the start versus Wolves, but also the start versus Luton, which would be very, very nice. And then I'd be playing Zinchenko in such a setup. So this is option number one free transfer used to go from Cash to Zinchenko. The midfield, as I said, well, it sort of plays itself, right? Salah, Saka, Son, Palmer, and Mbumo. 4.5 penalty takers in this team. Can't really complain with any of these options. The only bad fixture, of course, is Son, but I don't really think Son has a comparable. He's not even comparable, for example, to Archer, right? Archer's not a penalty taker. Son, for example, with this Tottenham team, all they try to do is attack. It's not like they're trying to defend. They're not going to try and suddenly become a defensive team, and that's what we've heard from Ange, and we've seen it. I believe it now, and the Spurs team are honestly a shocking defense, but they're also a very, very lethal offense. It just so happened, of course, in terms of the chances that they didn't put them away. I'm not even talking about the offside chances that Son scored, for example, but just, for example, opening chances in the start of the game with Udogie chances, for example, Kulusevski hitting the post, Porro hitting the post, things like that. The Spurs team is still very, very strong on attack, and even though Man City, of course, is a great defense, we can see, of course, some holes in it. So that's why I'm going to go with this midfield. And then in the attacking position, obviously just playing Watkins and Haaland in this setup. So this is option number one. Archer would be first on bench. Second on bench would be Colwell. Third on bench would be Pedro Porro, just because I don't really want to deal with a Spurs defender versus Man City at the Etihad. And we're sort of living with that sort of setup here with, of course, Turner on the bench as well. So that's option number one. Now, option number two for me is a little bit riskier, but I think it also has potentially a little bit more upside if I can get the minutes right for the players that I'm bringing in. So option number two is actually to go from Watkins to Darwin. And so what would change in this situation, of course, is Zinchenko won't be brought in. Cash will be on the bench. Colwell will start. Why Cash is on the bench versus Bournemouth away is simply because I think Bournemouth have actually been a relatively good attacking team. They've actually surged in terms of our expectations for attack. And my concern, of course, with Cash as well is the attack. The defense isn't particularly great with him in it. What Aston Villa have really stuck out this season with is their attack. And ultimately, Cash's underlying stats have been declining. His strength in terms of, let's say, how nailed he is in the team is also declining. Whereas with Colwill, finally, I can actually guarantee that he starts, and the start is versus a Brighton team that are quite diminished. So I quite like that. Also, I tend to like backing the home fixture for defenders. Unfortunately, last week, of course, I had two defenders who I had to sort of juggle between Colwill and Cash, who are both away. Now Colwill's at home, so this could be quite an interesting situation to play Colwill. And in this situation, I would be moving from Watkins to Darwin instead. Midfield stays exactly the same, but I would be going from Watkins to Darwin. And why Darwin, for example, in Game Week 14? I just think that if you were, let's say, to plan Darwin's minutes, expecting that, for example, he's going to be rested in the Europa League, or at least rested to the extent that he only plays 20 to 30 minutes maximum, I'm expecting, of course, that Darwin can actually play a lot of minutes in this really good fixture here versus Fulham at home, which is, of course, lovely. And then going forwards, I'm expecting that Darwin will be a consistent starter because of the Jota injury. But right now, what we can expect from Jota's injury is that, of course, it's going to boost Luis Diaz's minutes, but it's also going to boost Darwin's minutes because we know that Jota can be a very flexible player. He can play left wing and he can play centre forward as well. Gakpo, of course, is back in the team and he is someone who will be taking the minutes away from Darwin, but I do think Darwin is definitely first choice. The concern, of course, is what happens in Sheffield United away, right? In Game Week 15, the nice thing, I suppose, is that Watkins is facing Man City. So maybe our expectations for Watkins, because he's facing Man City and Arsenal back-to-back, are pretty awful. So I'm maybe going to let Darwin slide, for example, from an X-Min's point of view, right? Thinking that even if he doesn't play too many minutes versus Sheffield and he gets rested there, for example, maybe comes off the bench, does well there versus a very, very weak opponent, that's still a good situation for Darwin. And actually after that, the next time I would be bringing Watkins back into my team is, as I said, in terms of Game Week 18. And maybe I'll just be moving Mbeumo off of my team instead, bring in Gordon, and maybe, let's say, moving from Darwin to Watkins in that sort of situation, keeping Haaland in this team structure, keeping Salah in this team structure at around Game Week 18 until basically AFCON/Asian Cup forces transfers. So that's transfer option number 2. And why I'm, for example, literally 50-50 between those two options is because I think both Darwin and Zinchenko give a lot of upside in the short term, but also there are some risks, right? With Zinchenko, I have to get the minutes right with the Wolves start. I also have to get the minutes right with the Luton start. And what is nice, of course, is that we probably will get some good news over both players. And also the second thing as well is what I can do with the keeper transfer on Game Week 14, or rather Game Week 15, sorry. So if I was to, let's say, go Zinchenko, what that would do is force me into a triple Arsenal setup. So I'm no longer allowed to go from Areola to Raya. What I can do instead is I can go maybe from Areola to Kelleher for a few weeks and then move Kelleher to Flecken eventually after the blank game week. But I think that's very tight. It's not something that I'd really advise doing. Maybe I could also do something like Turner to Kelleher as well. But I think it's still a very risky play because, of course, we know that Alisson's injury is actually not as bad as expected as per Klopp's comments. And we do expect him to come back for that Man United fixture, which is, for example, the latest report that we got. But, of course, it's nice to maybe own a Liverpool defender at a cheap cup rate price. But I suppose the issue here, of course, is there's a risk with Zinchenko, as I said, and unfortunately, maybe Kelleher is not the sort of high upside move away from Areola in Game Week 15, as I might expect, depending on, let's say, how long Kelleher can play. So that's the one thing that sort of weakens the Zinchenko move a little bit. As far as option number 2, of course, the risk is really with Darwin's minutes, right? I might be guessing Darwin's minutes wrong. If he, let's say, gets benched versus Sheffield United away, if maybe Gakpo gets more minutes than we expect, then it's not exactly too much upside moving away from a great option in Watkins, who I actually own at a ridiculously sort of cheap price, given the fact that I have so much selling value, owned over him. So that's why I think that's a concern there, moving away from Watkins. But as stable as Watkins is, ultimately, I suppose he's not a penalty taker. The underlying stats still favor, for example, someone like Darwin with, let's say, less minutes. And so there's good competition, and I get a cost saving, and I also get Areola to Raya. So whilst, for example, Kelleher is a risk in the Zinchenko situation in terms of, I don't know how long, for example, he's going to play for this Liverpool team. The nice thing with Raya, I think, is we still expect that Ramsdale is going to be sitting on the bench basically, until the next Brentford fixture, effectively. So I would say with Raya, there seems to be a lot more upside. And I also think that Darwin's minutes are going to be really, really consistently good because ultimately, even when we head towards AFCON, his minutes should increase because once Salah's out of the team, it only basically gives Darwin more scope to stay in the team. So those are my sort of thoughts in terms of my 2 transfer plans. I'd love to know what you guys think in terms of the transfer plans as well. Right now, I think I'm leaning a little bit more towards going for Darwin this week, just because, as I said, I think the keeper option going to Raya is a lot more upside than, let's say, going for Zinchenko and then getting Kelleher. But maybe also, I'm also downplaying how strong and how good Watkins is. And, you don't know how good something is until you lose it, I suppose. So that could be the situation. Do let me know what your thoughts are in terms of the 2 transfer moves. I think those are generally my plans. In terms of the deep sort of long future for the transfer plans, though, one thing to think about, of course, is what other defenders will need, right? Because when Game Week 18 rolls around, I think that maybe we need another Newcastle defender. Getting an update on Botman, that's not something like, oh, he's training on grass and oh, he's touch and go and maybe he'll be injured or maybe he'll need surgery or maybe he'll be, training on grass for the next 3 to 4 weeks or year. I don't know. I need to get an update on Botman, and I think if I get a good enough update on Botman or Lascelles, for example, by proxy of getting a Botman update, let's say if he goes for surgery, then Lascelles is actually going to be one of the defenders that I'm going to be targeting, let's say Game Week 17 when Newcastle have good fixtures. As far as other transfers as well, I do think maybe in the future, looking towards a Man City defender could make sense as well. Someone like Walker, who seems to be still absolutely nailed. I will mention, of course, that we finally saw Walker basically lose a few minutes when he played a pretty poor game versus Red Bull Leipzig. However, that's, of course, a very unique circumstance. How many times have we seen sort of City get blown out of the park in the first half this season? So that's one thing to mention. Now, quickly moving on to captaincy this week. The reason why I'm actually leaning towards a Haaland captaincy is, as I said, changing expectations, right? What we know from underlying stats so far is this Spurs team is comfortably bottom half. And I would say, obviously, even when you just look intuitively, right, Romero out, Van de Ven out, that's a huge downgrade. And even from an aerial point of view, you're using fullbacks to defend against Haaland, who can have a lot of service at the back post, and those were the chances that Watkins effectively had in his game as well. So I'm quite concerned, of course, of the Spurs defense and effectively basically quite intrigued in the prospect of what Haaland can do versus this Tottenham team at home as well. So I am going to be favoring the Haaland captaincy. I think it's very close. Salah, of course, is a little bit behind in terms of goal scoring odds, but of course, he's got the assist odds there. He is also playing at home, has clean sheet opportunities too. I just think that maybe for a bit of upside here, sort of looking and expecting that the Spurs team is very, very weak on defense, I do think that Haaland is the captaincy to go for. So I will be moving towards a Haaland captaincy, and probably I would say that is going to be locked in. And yeah, let me know what you guys and your thoughts are on, let's say, options 1 and 2 or A and B. And otherwise, thank you guys so much for watching, and thank you so much to the members of the channel for financially supporting me. And I will see you guys as well on the next video. One thing that we're trying to work towards the end of the season, or this year rather, is 20K subscribers. So if you haven't subscribed already, please feel free to do so, and I will see you guys in the next video.